Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burkt and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by the Preservation Association of Lincoln. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. The membership is available on preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Jeff Korbelik. Jeff is the author of Lost Restaurants of Lincoln. He is the former Lincoln Journal-Star features editor and currently is the manager at James Arthur Vineyards in Raymond. He continues to write restaurant reviews for the Journal-Star Ground Zero entertainment magazine, which he's done since 1998. Jeff's talk today is also the title of his book, Lost Restaurants of Lincoln. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Korbelik.
Thanks, Eileen. This is a little overwhelming. I gave a talk out here in March or April for the 150th anniversary of the paper. We did the 150 most prominent or influential people, that kind of thing, and I think there was probably a dozen folks here. And and I was thrilled with that. But this is kind of scary. So bear with me. I'm sure you probably have I have a little slideshow with some pictures that are from the book. I think you might find interesting. If you haven't had the book already, I'll tell you little stories. I'll start with a little bit of background of how this all came about, and then I'll leave at the end for questions, because that's always the fun part is the questions. And I'm sure the first question everybody has is, why wasn't this restaurant in my book? So I can kind of get into that. As I do the intro here, I'll kind of get into the process, and you'll probably understand why I couldn't get all the restaurants into the book. As you saw, Cindy Langcubic, who's a friend of mine and one of my co-workers at the Journal-Star, I sat by her for 20-some years at the newspaper, did a very nice story, and you may have read about that as well. But starting out, the way this came about was I got a phone call from, or actually it was an email. It was an email from the publisher, Arcadia Publishing, and they're based out of South Carolina. And they do these memory books all over the country. And in fact, there was one, it's called The Lost Restaurants of Omaha. It's a very, very original name, okay? A young lady had written a book about old Omaha restaurants, so that's there. And then there's another one that I snagged that was Lost Restaurants of Cincinnati, and those kinds of things. So they specialize in these memory books. They target this because, you folks have memories, so they sent me a note and said, hey, could you recommend somebody to write this book? And I said, well, that might be me. I said, but I don't have very much time, because as a newspaper guy, you're just constantly writing all the time, and the last thing you want to do is go home and write more. So I gave them some names, I gave them some recommendations, and they came back to me and said, well, we would really like you to write this because you have, a little bit of history. And I do have a little bit of history. I've been here, I was born in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1964. That makes me 54 years old. Went to Lincoln Southeast, graduated there, went to the university here, got my degree in journalism and in English, back in the late 80s, and then started working in the newspaper business. So I worked at the Bellevue Leader, a weekly paper, worked in Grand Island. I was a sports editor there for 10 years before I came back to my hometown. I hope that goes back down, because I'm going to have to hit the buttons. So I came back and then came back to Lincoln in the mid '90s. Had an opportunity to work at the newspaper I grew up reading. And I was a big fan. Ken Hambleton, Randy York, Mike Babcock, these are all sports guys, and Chuck Sinclair. I grew up reading these guys and I wanted to be them, and I actually got a chance to work with Ken Hambleton for a number of years, so it was kind of a joy. So I was in the sports department, and then we launched this magazine called Ground Zero, and so Part of Ground Zero included, movies and the arts and dining. And it started out, everybody was going to be writing restaurant reviews. But then my editor at the time started, every week would go, well, Jeff, what are you going to write about this week? And I thought, well, what about Kent? I thought he was going to do the restaurant review this week. And so I ended up writing the restaurant reviews every week. My first one was Cracker Barrel. Cracker Barrel is still open. It's still going strong. So I didn't kill that one. So good. In fact, Cracker Barrel, when they read Cindy's story, I got a call from them and said that they were honored to be the first restaurant that I had written about, and they sent me a gift card in the mail. So that was very nice of them, and my wife was quite pleased with that. So I've been writing about restaurants for 20-some years. So I felt like I had a little bit of a background to do this book. And after some hemming and hawing, I told Arcadia that I would go ahead and do the book. And so the process, it was a little daunting because they gave me 6 months. 6 months to write it. So that's what the scary part. So if you're wondering why your restaurant isn't in the book, if I'd have had more time, I might have been able to get it in there. So I've had a lot of people say, well, what about volume 2? And I said, well, that could be on the back burner there. So I had 6 months, and the very first thing I was like, well, how do you decide which restaurants to write about? You have the obvious ones. People who've lived in Lincoln, as most of you folks have. They're Tony and Luigi's. Of course, you got to write about Tony and Luigi's because that was like, the fine dining restaurant in Lincoln, Nebraska, on O Street. And in fact, Dave Harrison is here. He's sitting right here. His photo's in the book. He was a longtime manager. He just came up and said hello to me before he started. So you had to have Tony and Luigi's. You had to have the Legion Club because if you remember. After the World War II, the veterans came back and they wanted a place to go, and so this was the hangout. My grandfather, my late grandfather, Frank Korbelik, was a musician, and he toured around Nebraska, and what he did was he played Legion clubs. That was the thing. You went, you had a nice meal, and you stayed, and there was dance bands, and you just, that was the thing. So for Lincoln, Nebraska, it was, Bob Logsdon was the general manager there forever, and this is where Bob Devaney hung out. So yeah, and so the Legion Club here in Nebraska is sort of tied in hand with Nebraska football, and if you read the book, you'll find that about the chapter about that. I talked to Bob's son, Rob, and we had a long, interesting talk about that. So Tony and Luigi's, the Legion Club had to be in there. Let me think, what else? Alice's. You got to have Alice's restaurant because I bet probably most of you at one time or another ate at Alice's. You stood in line to eat at Alice's restaurant. The line would go out, if you remember in college, you would go out on Sundays. You would go to church, and then you would go to Alice's. That was the thing you did. So, and then Alice's had 3 other restaurants in town, and I think a lot of people don't remember that she had one on Cottoner Boulevard for a little while too, and it was only around for about a year or two, and I don't think a lot of folks remember that. But I found that when I was doing my research. So you had to have the obvious ones, and so then I went back, and what I started with, I pulled out city directories, and I started in 1900. Started in 1900 and started looking through them, and back then, there weren't really restaurants per se in Lincoln, Nebraska. There were boarding houses, and people ate at boarding houses. So that's how it was done. So the list of restaurants was like this, just very tiny. But you had a long list of Sally's Boarding House, that kind of thing. So we went through that, and so what I was jotting down, and I would go from like 1900 to 1905 to 1910. I would do like these 5-year periods, and then I would see if there was names that were, there for a long time that was there in 05 and then 10 and then 15 and that kind of thing, and then started compiling a list. So then I wanted to include some of the longest, ones on it. In fact, here we go. This is one of the first restaurants that was in Lincoln, Nebraska. I don't know, did anybody eat at this restaurant? All right, nice. It opened in the late, I'd have to look back on my chapter there, but the late teens, but it was opened by the Christopoulos family, and they were known as the first Greek immigrants to Lincoln, Nebraska. They opened it up, they ran it, and it went for 50 to 60 years. It closed in the early 1960s. For a restaurant to last 50-some years is just remarkable. It was downtown. It was known, of course, by the name It's Chili, and it was also known to give you a lot of heartburn. So that was one of the first ones I saw. I went through, and so then I was looking. What I wanted to do is get some really old restaurants like the Acme Chili Parlor, and then some newer ones from like my generation and even a little bit younger than me who might remember. And so that would include, and there'll be a slide popping up, but like P.O. Pears. P.O. Pears was over on 9th Street. It was in my day was more known for as a club to go hang out on the weekends to try to pick up a girl. In my case, yeah. So that was that kind of thing, and they had a dance floor in the back, had the restaurant kind of in the middle part where you would order, and then they had a bar out front. But when you went in to order, it was the Lips, which you'll see come up here on the slide. So, all right, I already got a question.
Well, I was just going to say the Christopoulos family home was on the southwest corner of 28th and Elm. Still's there today. It's a beautiful home.
Oh, is it? Okay, good. So yeah, and Mr. Christopoulos, as I was doing my research, he was very big into the YMCA. He was a proponent of the YMCA, and I found that very interesting. So I wanted P.O. Pears, and then probably the most current restaurant in it is Maggie's Vegetarian Cafe. I sat down with Maggie in her kitchen, and we were talking about it, and Maggie told me she did not deserve to be in this book, in a book of Tony and Luigi's, and I said, Maggie, you are way wrong on this, because Maggie opened up a vegetarian restaurant in a beef state, and she ran it for 18 years, and she could still be running it if she wanted to. It was going strong. To run a vegetarian restaurant in a beef state is just remarkable what she did. So that was the newest restaurant. So we get the oldest to the Acme Chili Grill to the newest. And so as I was putting this together, then I noticed things that were falling into place. I was trying to figure out what the chapter should be, how should I divide this up, and I noticed when I was putting it together that there was a theme. So it was like restaurants and supper clubs, which is the first part of the book, and then the second part is the drive-ins, cafes, and diners. So there's a mix of them. There's probably about 15 to 16 on each section. The chapters are, fairly short. Some of them are a little longer, and I tried to write them. I tried to get the people element into it, and that was very important to me to get. You got to have the facts in it. You got to have this restaurant opened this time and it closed at this time and it was located at this intersection, that kind of thing. But you also need to know a little bit about who opened them and then and why these were memorable. And if you one of the chapters is called the Lebsacks Tavern, which was downtown. The reason why that was memorable was, again, they had good, they had chili that would give you heartburn, but there was 3 brothers who ran that place, and I guess they were quite the characters. And in fact, one of them was a good friend of Jim Ragland, who was a longtime columnist at the Lincoln Journal, and he wrote a lot about the Lebsacks Tavern, and I found a ton of information on it. And so that brings me back why some of the restaurants were included and not included was then I started doing my research when I got my list pared down into the restaurants and supper clubs and the cafes and diners over here, started researching and I dove into, we have a big library at the Journal-Star, and so I dove into that and these old envelopes, and I had clippings all over my office back there, and then I started digging up, and we had old photos at the Journal-Star, so I started digging into that, and I was finding and was putting the photos photos with the restaurants and doing all that stuff. And then there's a website called newspapers.com, which anybody you can pay to be. It's part of the ancestry folks who do that kind of thing. And so I had access to clippings that I would have had to gone into microfiche to find some of the stuff. With newspapers.com, it was the actual newspaper they have on digital now. So I could go and look at a paper from 1910 from the Lincoln Journal or from the Lincoln Journal Star. So of course I would just spend hours reading things that I didn't need to read, because I'm a history buff too, and it's just fascinating to read about those things. And so as I was doing the research on Ken Eddy's, which was a drive-in on 48th and O Street there, I stumbled across this article about how they ran into trouble. Mr. Gold ran into trouble with, there was a kind of a concrete garden settee kind of thing sitting on the corner, and he wanted it removed, but it was owned by the Lincoln Garden Club, and they said, hell no, that's not, that's there for a reason, that kind of thing. So I found that interesting. So I threw that into the Ken Eddy chapter, about how, and of course that thing's not there now. So he must have won in the long run. So it was those little. So I was looking for those little anecdotes, to make it kind of pop out a little bit more. For the rotisserie, remember over on 11th and O Street, it's now the Dish. So when I was doing that, I had to include Herb Thomas in that chapter. If you folks have ever ate at the Lincoln Exchange or the Dish and ever had Herb as your server, he was the most remarkable server I had ever had, or all of us had ever had. He made, whether you were a garbage truck hauler or the mayor of Lincoln, he made you feel the same. I mean, he was extraordinary. He was an extraordinary man. Ground Zero, we even said that Herb was the best waiter in Lincoln, best server in Lincoln. And I did a whole story about Herb and everything. And sadly, we lost Herb a few years ago, and I wrote his obituary for the paper. And so when I was doing the rotisserie, because people remembered that, because when the rotisserie opened, they let Herb run the basement, and it was called the Grotto. And that was kind of Herb's area, So he would run that area. And then if you remember when Bob Sepapor turned over the restaurant to Nodder, his son, Nodder brought the concept upstairs. So if you remember, the rotisserie turned into the Grotto for a while before Nodder sold it, and then eventually it became the Dish. But then there was a story when I sat down with Nodder. Nodder still owns a bunch of restaurants downtown. He owns Amu Manu and Yaya's Pizza and the Mars Bar there. And we were sitting in Mars Bar. We were chatting about it, and he was telling me stories about how his dad had his dad, who was an immigrant from Iran, came here during the Revolution to get away in the early '80s. Brought his family over here. Opened a restaurant. He was a restaurant guy in Iran, but opened a restaurant here. But he was doing things that people just, weren't doing in Lincoln, Nebraska at the time. Well, one of them was a rotisserie, So they finally had to stop doing the rotisserie because people wanted steak. Every time they'd come in, and he'd go, well, what about this chicken on the rotisserie? No, we want a steak. So, yeah. So they had, if you drive by the Dish now, you can watch the people sitting. And in fact, most restaurants now have big plate glass windows, that kind of thing. Well, that wasn't the theme back in the day. So they did it at the rotisserie, and they eventually had to put up curtains in those big windows because the diners inside didn't want the people on driving by on O Street to see them eating. So, but now, those curtains are gone. You can walk right by the Dish and you can see people eating because that's the thing to do. But so Bob Sepapor was a little bit ahead of his time. He had an open kitchen. Nobody had really open kitchens back then. And if you remember the rotisserie, you could see the guys back there, and they all wore baseball hats, or not baseball, bicycle hats, and they had the bill flipped up. That's because most of their chefs were cyclists. And so, yeah, and in fact, their bikes were parked in behind back in the alley usually, along with Herb, because Herb rode his bike to work every day. So yeah, so I wanted to include, you know, the people element of it, and then I wanted the other thing I wanted to was to get all over town, you know, spread across. So one of the chapters is in Havelock, Norma's Cafe. It was there for 20 plus years, and so I sat down with Norma and her family, sat down with her son in Leroy's kitchen, and we sat and we just talked about it, and she talked about how people would just come off the interstate because they'd heard about Norma's Cafe, and you needed to get the sausage, you know, the eggs and biscuits and sausage, you know, that kind of thing. So they would, come in, and then would do a lunch special, and you could get in and out of there in like 20 minutes, you know, because they would have this daily lunch special. So, and if you remember, Norma's was just down the block from Misty's, and everybody knows the Havelock because of Misty's and the aisles, you know, that kind of thing. So Misty's is not in the book because it's still around. So yeah, so some people said, well, what about Valentino's and what about Runza and what about Misty's? Well, they're still going strong. All those restaurants are going strong. So these are the lost restaurants that are happening. So, all right, I'm going to take a little drink here, so because I'm kind of babbling here, and I'm going to show you another slide. All right, this is Bob Logsdon. Bob Logsdon was a longtime general manager at the Legion Club. That's the Legion Club. On Sundays, they would do a buffet. So there he is, checking that out. You know, what I like about the Legion Club is, you know, what I mentioned this before was the dance bands. I mean, they had famous people that would play here that would come up. Jay McShann from Kansas City would play. They had the top artists that were from, you know, basically from the Midwest that would come up and play, and it was a big deal. It was a big deal. If you remember back in the day, you would get a steak, and then you would dance the night away. So this is the first Mexican restaurant in town. Had to, of course, include this. The first Mexican restaurant was the Taco Hut, which was the predecessor to Arturo's. The Taco Hut was where the infamous Block 35 is, what is now Embassy Suites. If you remember, it sat like a parking lot after they tore down all these great buildings that were there, including Arturo's and Dirt Cheap and a bar that I went to when I was in school, McGuffey's, you know. So yeah, so I have very fond memories of this. When I sat down with Rennie and Daniel Longoria, and we talked about when his grandparents opened the Taco Hut, and nobody in Lincoln, Nebraska knew what Mexican food was. They hadn't really tried it, and so their grandmother had to figure out a way to get people to eat Mexican food. And so this is in the book, but she would, the people that would be working, the street workers and that kind of thing, she would entice them in with pie. You know, and get them, hey, come in and have a piece of pie. So they'd come in, get some pie and coffee, you know, that kind of thing. And then she would bring out the Mexican food from the kitchen, and she had a captive audience. They're eating the pie, they're drinking the coffee. Here, try some of this. What do you think of this? You know, they would try that, and how okay. And then she'd go back to the kitchen, she'd bring out a little more. What do you think of this? So, yeah, next time you might want to order this, and bring your friends and bring your family, you know, that kind of thing. So that's how Mexican food took off in Lincoln, Nebraska. So, and if you remember, Arturo's had a couple of locations in Lincoln, the downtown one, and then they also opened out on 70th Street for a while before they closed. The Longorias, they own several Taekwondo studios now here, so they're still going strong. Rennie brought his mother, Carmen, in for my book signing at 4 Star, and I just about cried. So it was so nice to see her. So. If you remember, both Art and Carmen would work the floor if you ever ate. So Carmen would greet you as you came in, and she would seat you down, and then Art was always walking around to all the tables and talking to everybody. That opened in the 60s. So yeah, so Mexican food came to Lincoln in the 60s, early 60s. It's about 65 if I remember right. Okay, so this is a poster from the Drumstick with advertising one of their regulars, Charlie Burton. Charlie Burton is probably one of the most famous rock and rollers to come out of Lincoln, Nebraska. The Drumstick was a 24-hour chicken restaurant on North 48th Street. It's where McDonald's is right now, and so And people went there for chicken. Like I said, when they opened it, originally wasn't 24 hours, but then they wanted the bar crowd. So then they opened it up, and that was when they did most of their business, was from about 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. So people would, they'd have a few beers, and then they'd go and eat a lot of fried chicken. So that's how. But then Mr. Lohmeyer, his wife died tragically in a car accident, and so he turned the restaurant over to the kids. One of the sons had come home from Maine for the funeral, for his mom's funeral, stayed here to help his brothers and sisters run the restaurant, and he was kind of a wild party guy and loved his music. And he said, well, why don't we just try to start playing some live music on that kind of thing? And sure enough, the Drumstick today is still known as one of the top live music venues in Lincoln, Nebraska. It had Joan Jett and the Blackhearts played out there. In my chapter, I mentioned REM played out there. The Red Hot Chili Peppers. Some of these now famous rock bands would come in and they would play the Drumstick. And the funny thing is that the musicians would come in, and when they would, when their agents would book them the Drumstick, they're thinking, they're thinking Drumstick. If you read the chapter, Peter Buck from REM comes walking in, and he sees, two families sitting there eating fried chicken, and he was like, oh, Drumstick, okay. So, yeah. All right, so this is the chapter. This is Kay Brestol in the middle of the photo there, and she's talking to James Brooks. James Brooks is the director of Terms of Endearment. So that was my angle on that one. I, of course, had to include Kay's, and you could do so many things. And I did add a lot of the other stuff about Kay's. If you remember, Kay's had a room that was dedicated to lions. Yeah, Kay collected lions. And then, since when people knew that Kay collected lions, whenever they went on a trip, they would bring Kay more lions. So she had lions all over the place. As you can see, there's a photo in the background of a lion on the wall. But it's probably best known, it's the only time Lincoln has had an Academy Award-winning picture filmed here. Yeah, and many of the shots were done at Kay's. And so I had a nice conversation with Kay. She was living in Florida at the time. She has now moved back to Lincoln, and she came to my signing at 4 Star, and I didn't even know she was back in town. And I looked up, and there she was standing there. I was like, oh my God, Kay! So yeah, so we had to include Kay's. It's over in, if you remember, it's in Piedmont. Piedmont, it's where the Piedmont Bistro is now. So, all right, here we talked about Ken Eddy's before. Look at the old cars there. That's from the 50s. I got this photo from Jim McKee, and Jim helped me out a ton. I got about 20-some photos from Jim. Some of the photos I got from the family, from the families of the folks I interviewed. I interviewed more than 20 people for the book to get this done. And then I of course raided our archives at the Journal-Star to get a bunch of photos as well. All right, as a kid, this was a highlight for me to go to King's, and I got to call in the orders. My sister got to call in, or we both got to call in. But you can see that's the King's. I believe this one was the one on 48th Street. But it was novel at the time. You would go in and sit down, and that's everybody kind of has. I think everybody in this room probably has a story about King's. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and it was probably the most successful local chain to start out with. And from now today we have Amigos is local, Runza is local, Taco Inn is local. Those are all based out of Lincoln, but King's was the one. So, and the Price family, and then the offshoots from the Price family, the pantry, which will probably be in book 2. Okay, so the pantry, Howard's Pantry, the lunch counter at Parkway Lanes, yes, with Fred and Ruby's. So yeah, those are all offshoots of it. This is Kurt and Pearl Cool. They own Cool's Restaurant downtown. When I started putting this together, I immediately had to include Cool's because Kurt and Pearl are family friends. So that was a personal thing with me. Pearl's brother is my dad's best friend, one of my dad's best friends. So I had to include it. So this is them standing in their location at 17th and Van Dorn. It's where the Normandy is now. So that's where they originated. And then they moved, and then they were over in Rathbone Village for a little while. They ran a restaurant there, and then they came downtown and ran a couple of restaurants in the hotels that were down. And one of them was where the YMCA is now, and the other is where the Graduate is. And then they had an opportunity to take over a spot on O Street, and the rest is history. So. And then when you ate at Cool's, you would get a Cool's burger. So what was a Cool's burger? So in my book, I included a lot of recipes from some of the restaurants. In the 1980s, the Lincoln started this thing called Chef's Corner. And so I was able to find a ton of recipes for places like Kay's, although Kay did share a recipe with me. But then when talking to Pearl, the Cool's burger was what they would call a gourmet stuffed burger today, and there's the story of how the Cool Burger came about. It was a Lincoln businessman who came in and said, I would like a cheese stuffed into 2 patties, cheese and onions stuffed into 2 patties, on a bun, and so that's how the Cool Burger basically came about. So here's Maggie. Here's Maggie at her restaurant in that little window that was way too short. I always tease Maggie, if you ever went to Maggie's and you were my height, you had to do this in order to order. And Maggie, when she had the window built in there, she did it for her height, not thinking that people would be taller than her who had to order. So that's Maggie's restaurant. All right, here's one of the stories I wanted to include. This is Arnie Peterson. He is baking Miller and Payne cinnamon rolls there. Now, Miller and Payne was one of those must-haves in the book. That Miller and Payne had to be in here. The tea room up on the 5th floor was kind of a go-to place. It was kind of an icon of the downtown scene back in the day. I got an opportunity to meet Mr. Peterson, and he baked me some cinnamon rolls when I went over to do a story on him, and he shared some of the secrets, but he never told me how to make the cinnamon rolls. But then again, that was one of the things, and so I included Arnie's story in the chapter about Miller and Payne, and you still have the history of how the tea room came about, but then you have a little bit of the people element to it. All right. Did anybody eat at this place? Because this is way before my time. So, and this is the Mug. And if you notice, it was about 33rd and O Streets, right around there. You notice, and that's what's amazing too. It's 33rd and O Streets, and it looks like it's in the middle of a cornfield. So that's how rural Lincoln was at the time. It was in the shape of a mug, and you can see the eyes at the top. The order counter was the mouth. And then at night when they closed it, it was like white shutters, so it looked like teeth. Looked like teeth that would go across. So that was one of the famous drive-ins that was in Lincoln back in the 30s. This is Norma and her husband. This is at the cafe. I love the fact that she wears a uniform that kind of reminds me of the TV show Alice, with Flo and all that kind of stuff. But you can't see that in a photo, but there's a lot of stuff that's in behind them that her husband built to make life easier for them when they were running the restaurant. So back in the day, if you ever worked at a restaurant and you had to marry ketchups, do you know what I mean by marrying ketchups, where you had to pour? Yeah. He had built a contraption for Norma and the rest of the staff to do it so that they could tip the bottle and then start doing it. You didn't have to stand and hold it, and they could do something else and come back, and then it would be, that kind of thing. So her husband was instrumental and kind of a handyman. All right, there's the lips. And then I included this photo because I love the fact that there's a Lie Awake poster on that. Lie Awake was one of the prominent cover bands that played back in the 80s and 90s. But there's a couple of the cooks, and that's where you'd order your hamburgers, And P.O. Parish became known for their Burger Madness on Sundays, if you remember right. So they coined the phrase Burger Madness. Yeah, that's Herb. That's Herb at the rotisserie with those big windows. You see the curtains on the windows there. So, all right. This was another one that had to be included. And, when I was a little kid, I always thought the drive-through was supposed to be on the passenger side of the cart because my mom handled all the money. So yes, so my dad would be driving, my mom would reach into her purse to get the money and hand it. So I thought that was the way it was supposed to be done. Yeah, and then when they saw all these drive-throughs started popping up with it on the driver's side, I said, this doesn't make sense, you know, so we had to, so I had to include Tasty. You know, it was probably the longest running drive-in in Lincoln. It lasted over 50 years. We were all sad to see it go when it closed a couple of years ago. I know when they made the announcement that the Lincoln police had basically had to come out to monitor traffic because there was a huge line of people trying to get in to get their one last Tasty or onion chips or that dip. So yeah. All right. And then I got one more, another slide here. This is Tony Alicio. This is probably the most famous restaurateur of Lincoln, Nebraska. This is Tony sipping something out of the pan, probably one of the sauces. This was the most fun chapter I had to write. I sat down with Tony's son, Mike Alicio, and Mike's cousin, Tony Massinio. They both own Valentino's now. And so if you've ever been in a room with two Italians, actually Sicilians, and say, would you like to talk about food? It was quite entertaining. So I said, hey, I need you to talk about Tony and Luigi's. And I just sat my microphone in between them. And that's the way I wrote that chapter, because I was trying to figure out how to capture. How do you capture Tony and Luigi's? Well, you capture Tony and Luigi's by having these two guys tell stories about it. And when Mike would start talking, Tony would finish his sentence, and Tony would start talking, and Mike would finish his sentence, and then they were talking at the same time, and they were saying the same things, and they were talking about, you know, on Nebraska football Saturdays about how crowded it was and how all the different rooms, which had different names, like the Venetian, is that right? The Venetian, and how they would be crowded, and how they were trying to get people to their seats, and there would be a huge line out the door, and then they talked about how the famous people, and Mike tells me the story which is in the book about that he came in because he had to pick up his dad, and they said his dad was upstairs talking to Bob Taylor, and he thought, oh, Bob Taylor, the weather guy. Yeah, I'll go up and say hello, you know. If you remember, Bob Taylor was a longtime 10-11 weather guy. Went upstairs. It wasn't Bob Taylor. It was Robert Taylor, the actor. Yes. Robert Taylor, the actor, who's from Nebraska, of course. And of course, Mike walked in and did a double take, and his dad was talking to Robert Taylor like it's his best friend, you know. But that's how Tony was. Everybody was his best friend. So, and I think that's part of the reason Tony Luigi is so successful, because he came in and he made you feel welcome at his restaurant. So, and of course, and then everybody has, and even Tony and Mike said they have memories that first dates, you know, or significant anniversaries or significant birthdays. You know, if you had an occasion, Tony and Luigi's was the occasion restaurant, and that's where he went. They shared a photo of it when it first opened in the 50s, and it was on the edge of town. It was rural Lincoln, and it was kind of scary back then. I mean, they would talk about how there would be, you know, fights in the parking lots and that kind of thing. So it was an interesting time. So they were a bottle club back in the day. So if you go in, you know, if you remember the Lincoln dining scene, for some of you in the 60s, you know, there were a lot of bottle clubs back then, where you would bring the drink and they would provide the setup, you know, and the laws didn't change until, and I found that again, I was on newspapers.com and I was reading all these stories about the city council, and they were debating whether they should allow restaurants to sell liquor, you know, because that was a big deal. That was a big deal for them, and the supper clubs kind of went by the wayside after the liquor was allowed to sell, so it wasn't that big of a deal anymore. The Esquire Club is in there because this is a funny story I have to tell. That this is in the book. This is just a personal story. I included the recipe for their beer dip. Do people remember the beer dip? Basically, it's beer dip It's cream cheese, horseradish, and beer, and some garlic salt, so you'd mix it up. But what the Esquire did, they would serve it, because they would have like this buffet table kind of thing, and you could get veggies or chips or something with the dip, but they would put red food coloring in it. So it was pink. It was pink in color. So my mom made this all the time growing up. Again, this was just, I thought this was normal. If you had chip dip, it was going to be pink, So pink chip. So we had that. So my wife and I ate at my parents' house a couple of years back, and my mom had made this beer dip from the Esquire Club, that she made, and she put it. And my wife thought it was some kind of strawberry thing because it was pink in color. And so she took a big scoop of that and ate it. And of course, it tastes like horseradish, And she was like, "Oh my God, what is this?" I said, "Well, it's chip dip." She goes, "Why is it pink?" And she couldn't get over the fact that it was pink. And I said, "Well, that was the big deal at the Esquire Club. It was the pink beer dip." So I included the Esquire Club. So I was talking to Dave earlier. One of the restaurants I wanted to include was the East Hills Supper Club. I couldn't find a lot of information on it. I was digging in. The newspapers just didn't write a lot about it. I found we had one photo in our archives about it, but it just not about, I couldn't find like who owned it and who, worked there and that kind of thing. So I couldn't find a lot. But I mean, there's several others that had some interesting story. The Greenwich Cafe downtown. So in the book, I tell the story about how the fish and chips came about. They were known for their fish and chips, and it was a university professor. It was his recipe, and Millie and her husband Weiler. Who have a connection to the Valentino's family, the Weilers, if you notice, a lot of these restaurants have connections to each other, and a lot of the restaurateurs know each other and were friends back in the day. So the Greenwich Cafe, and that was, I added the Skylight Bistro again. That was for personal reasons, because that was the first place I had duck. I had never had duck until I was in my early 20s. My dad wasn't a hunter, so I'd never had a duck, and so I included that. So.
I was the original owner of the Skylight Bistro.
Oh, you did. So yeah, see, and that's what. And some folks, some of you have worked at some of these restaurants. Am I not mistaken? So yeah, how many in the book? Like how many people have worked in a restaurant that's in the book? There's a few. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I thought. So. Yeah, I included some of the buffets, Bishop Buffet. Yeah, Bishop Buffet that started downtown and then moved out to Gateway. Noel's Restaurant. I wanted, again, it was trying to spread around town. When Noel's was built out there at Old Cheney. When I was a kid, Old Cheney was like the end of town, and it was cornfields out there. So to see how the town has grown today, it's just amazing. I know all of you feel the same way. You just look, you're like, wow, yeah. So that was the how the book came about and how the chapters came, and the book, they do have some books here if you want to buy one. So I encourage you. I'm doing a signing Saturday at Indigo Bridge. I'll be there at 1:00. So if you want to come out and say hello to me there, now I will take some questions here. So if you have anything you want to, go ahead.
I'm trying to remember the name of the restaurant. Somebody may will help me. You're at 27th and Vine, and you're heading north. And about 2 to 3 blocks before you get to Holdridge, on the left, there used to be a restaurant back in there.
Yeah, I'm hearing. So he's asking about a restaurant that was near 27th and Vine. Yeah, and I hear somebody say Chubbyville. And West Side.
It's on the right going north.
Yeah, so it's I know when my dad got the book and he was looking through it, he goes, "Where's Foster's?" So that was my dad's retired state patrol. And that was a big hangout for the state patrolman, was that. And I said, "Dad, that'll be in book 2." So So, yes. Another restaurant I wanted to include that my dad ate at when he was on the road back in the day was the Congress Inn. And I had done some preliminary research on that. If you remember, Congress Inn was basically the first Chinese restaurant in Lincoln, Nebraska. But again, when I was digging into our archives and stuff, there's just not a lot of information, and there's not any family that are still around from the days of, from the Congress Inn. So I kind of left that for another time. So, but yeah.
Well, Lincoln Exchange.
Yeah, the link.
Second volume.
Yeah, well, Lincoln Exchange is in this one. Yeah, it's in there. Yep, I tied that story in. I did a signing at Francie and Finch a couple of weeks ago, and that is the bookstore downtown, and that's where the Lincoln Exchange was. It was a restaurant that was at 13th. A lot of restaurateurs got their start. Billy's, Nodder, Farabod worked at the Lincoln Exchange before he opened his own restaurant. Say that again?
Herb.
Yeah, Herb, yep, and that's Herb worked, and you wanted to go to the Exchange again for Herb, yep, before he went over to work for the Sepapor family over there, so, yeah.
But the Soul Food Kitchen.
Yeah, I had somebody ask me about that. Yeah, I had another one, so, yeah, book 2, book 2 on that, so, book 2, maybe book 3 on that, yes.
The underground.
The Underground is in here.
Okay.
Yes, yes. So that one, yes. So and it's combined with Brittany's because that was in kind of the same space area there. So
What was the restaurant that, they were famous for their hot beef sandwiches, and they had these kind of risque 1980s ladies in there, and they had a fabulous bar.
that might have been Brittany's. That
Oh, no, this was an old place. It was gone by 70. 1970. What street? It was downtown on like.
was it the Hobnob? Oh, was it the Hobnob? Yeah, the Hobnob. And that was on my list to start with. So yes. So yeah, and again, a lot of it was just time. I only had 6 months to get this together. So in the writing process, I did all my research early. Then I spent 2 months doing interviews. So driving all over town and sitting down with people, which include like Grandmothers is in the book. So I sat down with the general manager there, and so. Yeah, the Lovenstein, that was, my father-in-law asked where that one was at. So, yes, so my entire family has been after me. Yes. So that part, and then I taped every interview I did, and so then I spent another month just transcribing my tapes, and then I spent 2 months secluded in my office at my house just writing. And one of my close friends, Jill Morstead, who's an English professor at Union College, edited everything I wrote, and before I sent it off. So, yeah.
I don't know whether you understood me, but I was the original owner of this kind of.
Oh, you're the original owner. Welcome. Okay, so I might have you sign my book. Yes. Okay. All right.
Do you know anything about the Lincoln Commercial Club? Was that, obviously it was a private club. Was that
Yeah,
considered
and
a
and that was, and I was going back and forth with private clubs because I decided I wanted to keep it to the places that were open to the public, so that was that everybody could enjoy, so that's so I.
Were there many of those private clubs?
Well, there is, there were, and some of them are still, like the Nebraska Club and the University Club, and, so there were a handful of them. But back in the 60s, a lot of the supper clubs you had to be a member of in order to enjoy some of these places, so.
I'm wondering if anyone here remembers the Monterey Cafe on North 48.
She's asking if anybody remembers the Monterey Cafe on North 48. So yeah, there's a few hands there. So, and that's what I've enjoyed when I've done the signings and stuff. People will come up and they'll share their memories with me, and so I get a lot of Tony and Luigi's memories over the years, and a lot of King's. So those are I think the two biggies, that somebody has a story that's related to one or the other of those restaurants. Something happened to them, back in the day that stuck in their heads. So, yeah.
Was there a pattern that emerged as to why these places closed?
Again, a lot. It was the restaurateurs themselves. When they decided it was time not to run a restaurant anymore, then they sort of faded away. So, Bob Sepapor decided he didn't want to run it. He turned it over to his son. Nader ran it for a while, and then Nader said, I don't want to run full-service restaurants anymore. I want to more of the quick. So he changed the whole idea there. I think the reason Tony and Luigi's is not around is because everybody identified Tony and Luigi's with Tony. I think, Dave, you might be able to say that. I mean, that's, the family ran it for a while, and then they, sold it. But you thought of Tony and Luigi's, you thought of Tony Alicio. I mean, that's how it was. Yeah, Rubens is in here. I added Rubens. Rubens is like one of the first chain restaurants that sort of hit Lincoln, Nebraska. Now you look around, there's a chain restaurant on about every corner. So
I think that was the division of a lot of the restaurants because
the chains started.
came in.
Yes, I agree with Dave there too. And I've written stories about this, about how the evolution of the Lincoln restaurant industry has happened, and it has. You don't see as many locally owned places, and it's a struggle. And I think a lot of the locally owned places that we have today are the ethnic restaurants. So you see those are family owned restaurants tend to be more, and where the the meat and potato kind of places are the Outbacks and those kinds of things. So yeah.
Did you look into like the Cornhuskers restaurants?
Yeah, I did a little bit, and because there was like the TP Lounge, and again, there wasn't a lot of info in our archives beyond advertisements for them. So
And then the Compass Room that was at the airport?
yeah, see, that doesn't ring a bell at all. So yeah, yeah. So
I
Oh.
go to restaurants a lot, and I notice in the restaurants, one of the things that the predominant crowd is basically the people our age.
Yeah.
There's not young people coming to restaurants anymore, and I don't know if it's gonna, lead to the demise of the ones we have now.
right.
And also, I wanted to mention Scott's.
Oh yeah, Scott's Pancake House, and there is a reference to Scott's Pancake House in the chapter about Kay's, because Kay got her start at Scott's. She got her start. Okay, I had a question here in the blue.
Yeah, it's my impression that starting a restaurant and keeping it open is terribly hard work. And the whole family is there almost all the time and has.
It is, yeah.
Life. Why, as you talk with these people, why do they persist?
Yes, yeah. Well, that was, and if you notice, she was talking about the families and the restaurants and how hard a work it is. And it is, the Longoria family is not running a restaurant anymore. They're running a taekwondo place, So all those kids worked at the restaurant, but then they decided that wasn't for them because they saw how hard their grandparents first and then their parents worked, and they had kids themselves, and they wanted to be able to spend time with their families. So it takes, I think, a unique individual, because the hours are strenuous. You're working when everybody else is enjoying. That's kind of deal. So
That's his menu.
I think I remember this restaurant he mentioned. It was Brody's Barbecue. Was
Brody's Barbecue.
Yeah.
Does that ring a bell?
Well, this restaurant used to be the Bluebird restaurant.
Oh.
Oh yeah. There was, in fact, there was a Bluebird, and there was several iterations of the Bluebird as I was looking through the city directory. So the Bluebird moved all over town, and when I was doing the research, I couldn't figure out if it was the same Bluebird or if it was a Bluebird, and then another one that opened about 5 or 6 years later, if that was a different Bluebird. So so there was a Bluebird.
Lincoln Hotel that was
Yeah.
around in the 50s, my family and I.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, she said it was in the old Lincoln Hotel. So, all right, I can take 3 more questions. Is that? No, I have 3 more minutes. I have 3 minutes. Okay, three more minutes. Okay. Yeah, the Yum Yum Hut is in the book. Yeah, and it did. Yeah, both Tasties and Yum Yums. But do people know what Yum Yums are? Yeah, and what is Lincoln's fascination with loose meat sandwiches? That just amazes me, because we had Tasties, we had Yum Yums, and and there were a variety of other places that sold the loose meat sandwich. I kind of get it, especially in post World War II, that it was economical to make, but
Kind of smash them together.
yeah. So
Hong Kong pizza cake.
yeah, Hong Kong pizza. Yes, book 2.
Okay.
Yeah, book 2. Yes.
Thanks.
So of all these restaurants, which do you miss the most, and which dish do you miss the most?
Oh yeah. Well, I probably ate at half of these that I wrote about, because I'm old enough to remember. Like some of these, I'm too young to remember. Like the Acme Chili Grill, I was closed before I was even born. But the places, I have fond memories, because I remember the Drumstick, but it was going there to hear a band play, that kind of thing. For Pears, it was for, it was a college scene at that time. But I went there on Sundays because they had cheap hamburgers. So I really missed that. I missed the tachas at Arturo's, So so I even have the recipe. Daniel shared the recipe with me for the tachas, so that's in here. I missed the buffet at Noel's Restaurant. I think, they had a carving station, so I love that very much. I missed Cool's Restaurant. I missed that. I missed Maggie. I missed seeing Maggie. I would go down from the office. I would go down and say hello. I miss going down to see her, and the steakhouse. The steakhouse had, its own, little story. It was over on Cornhusker and had all these, animals that the owners had shot, so yeah, on the wall. So
This was from 70.
College memory of King's. I suggested to my friends we go to King's.
right,
I'm picturing 40th and South.
40th and South. That was one of the.
They said, nobody goes there, it's too crowded.
Oh, did they? Yeah. So, all right.
Thank you very much.
All right. I guess I'm wrapping it up. Thanks, folks.